Dr. Jazz.
I want to start our
Dr.
talk. I mean, I've listened to your music for such a long time, but I want to start with your talk with your duo with Miguel Zenon. And, you've been no stranger to duo saxophone and piano, obviously with Lee, who we mentioned, and Ben Wendell, and uh, all these amazing musicians. And, I did this talk with Luis Perdomo last year, and they also
Mm.
did a duo with Miguel. And
Mhm.
it's such completely different stories. And I wanted to ask you, like, what's your story with Miguel? And when did you guys start playing together?
Yeah, so Miguel has been a musician that I've deeply admired for a long time and got to play with him for the first time about 10 years ago. It was with in a band with Alexis Cuadrado. I don't know if you know him. He's a
Yeah, yeah, the bass player,
Brooklyn-based
sure. I love his
bass
music.
player and composer. And then I had a duo series in an art gallery in New York. It was called the Katinka Tabakaru Art Gallery.
Mm.
And I played every week for, I forget, 6 weeks or something like that.
Oh,
We brought in a special piano, and one of my guests was Miguel. And one of the things that I was doing on each one of these gigs was writing music for each musician.
oh,
I also played with Billy Hart and bassoonist Rebecca Heller and Gilad Hexelman. And
mm.
um, anyway, so I wrote a couple songs for Miguel, and then it also turned out that he'd written a series of 4 pieces for piano and saxophone that had never been recorded and had only been performed once.
Mm.
And so I learned one of them because they're all really hard.
Yeah.
I didn't have much time. And I loved the music and I loved playing with Miguel. And so then it was like, okay, let's do this again. I want to learn some more of this. And so basically over a few gigs, we built up this repertoire. I also wrote more music for him, and we played all 4 of these compositions that he'd written for piano and saxophone. And we just kept playing over the last 10 years. And finally, in 2018, I think it was, we made this record in the summer. And I intended to put it out in early 2020. And we were going to do some touring. We already had some gigs booked. And then, of course, everything was canceled by the pandemic. And so we decided to delay it so that we could tour it. But then it took so long for things to return to any kind of semblance of normalcy that by the time I put it out, it was 2023.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I love it. How you have a nice connection. And so,
Man, he's such an inspiring
beautiful. Yeah.
musician. I mean, it's just amazing. The kind of, I think he's one of the artists who most combines incredible precision with depth of soul. There are people who are very precise and there are people who are very soulful. It's rare that you got people who are like that level of precision with that level of soul.
Mm.
It's so deep, and I really love his composing too. I find it very inspiring, and it's a very inspiring person. I really
Yeah.
love playing with him.
Yeah. It's amazing. I mean, we did this talk with Miguel, I think last year, and we were just talking about his compositions, and it's interesting. He has this 11 through 19 over 6, blah, blah, blah rhythms, yet it's still so groovy that you're like, damn, this is so good. And yet it's so heavy, when you start analyzing it. And that's also
He
one
makes
aspect.
everything sound natural.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That's such an important part. Yeah. Are you
Yeah.
guys gonna tour this year, Europe with as a duo already, or you already?
No immediate plans to tour.
Okay.
Yeah, the thing is, his duo record with Luis, won a Grammy,
Really, I didn't
and
know
so
that.
of
Oh, okay.
course, yeah, it actually won a Grammy, which is
Wow.
amazing. It didn't, it
Wow.
wasn't not just nominated, it actually won a
Wow.
Grammy award. So, I think that's a priority for him to tour that, very understandably.
Yeah.
Also, Luis, I mean, Luis has been in his band for decades.
Yeah.
I know that Miguel really digs our duo as well, but I think if we tour it, it'll probably have to wait a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I didn't know for the Grammy. Wow, congrats,
Yeah,
everyone. What
yeah,
about
that's great.
you as a band leader? The last one you did was Inventions and Reinventions, and have you been preparing something new also on the band leading department? I mean, with original music, or what's happening there?
Yeah, so I've had so during the pandemic, I did a ton of live streaming. That was like my main creative outlet during the pandemic. And I tried to write as much music as I could for these live streams. And so I ended up writing dozens of new compositions. And I've been planning on recording those for a while. So actually I did record some of them with Jorge Roeder and Eric Harlan, because those were two of the guys that I most played with in those live streams. But I want to add to it. I want to kind of make a record that recapitulates to a certain extent the many collaborations that happen in those live streams with lots of different people. So that'll probably be my next record. I've been super busy this year because I actually just at the end of June, I played some big concerts, played the Ravel Piano Concerto in G, and I wrote a song cycle for Cecile McLaurin-Salvant and String Orchestra, which was premiered. And before that, I wrote a piece for choir and piano that was on these texts that my mom left behind when she died. And so I've been super busy with that stuff. And now, just starting, a few weeks ago, I have a little bit of time to start thinking about the future again.
Yeah. How do you usually write when I know those early trios already with Richie and Jorge, and what's your story?
Thanks for checking that stuff out, man.
Oh man,
That's amazing.
I mean, I love that. That's like almost 20 years ago, and it's
that's
it
crazy.
still sounds
Yeah,
fresh,
the first one, you're right, is 2005.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I like the takes on Billie Jean and Giant Steps. It's kind of tunes like, and you really reinvented them. I love that. Like, but to your original writing, how do you usually start? Like, just noodling on piano, or like do you set a goal like, okay, I'm gonna explore something? Or
Yeah, that's evolved a lot over the years. I feel like when I was younger, it tended to be more like playing the piano and some idea comes up and I'm like, oh, I want to write that down, and then I would develop it into a piece. But I think as I've matured as a composer, pieces tend to start with some kind of constraint.
Yeah.
Find constraint extremely useful. So for example, during the pandemic, actually, I wrote a ton of pieces, and the thing with them, I mean, a lot of the constraint was time. Like I would write them in about an hour.
Oh, okay.
And so it's like first thought, best thought kind of stuff, but also combining that with just some kind of nuts and bolts knowledge of how harmony and form works. These are things that I've studied a lot over the last 10 years and that have really made me grow as a composer. And I'm talking fundamentals like in the same way that Bach uses them, and later composers. But fundamental ideas about tonal harmony and form, bringing those into the equation, and then ideas about motivic development. And so I think as I grow older, I approach it much more like a craftsman. Like I know that if I just have, one tiny building block, then I can build a piece out of it. And that building block doesn't even have to be anything brilliant. It could be like just a couple notes. You could build a whole piece out of that. And so I feel like, I guess as I get older, it's less going into the complete unknown, and more approaching it like a craftsman. But to be honest, that's really different when I'm writing the kinds of things that I've been writing recently. So the process that I've just been describing, that would be like writing tunes for jazz musicians.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which I find is such a different process. I liken that almost to like writing poetry, because labor wise, it's so little, right? Like what you actually write on the page when you're writing a composition for jazz musicians, it's very little. I mean, you're writing a melody, you're writing some chords, maybe you're writing a bass line, but it's so little labor. It's like writing a poem. It's not that many words, right? Whereas writing the kinds of pieces that I've just been writing, like for choir and piano, or for string orchestra and singer, that's like writing a novel. That's like a lot of labor. It's just a ton of writing. And I think those two processes are very different for me. The first one has actually, over the years, started to feel really easy, like fun. Like I'm in the sandbox and I'm just kind of playing, and I know something cool is going to come out, but the real kind of classical composer aspect of it is like still feels really hard, and I like that difficulty. I mean, it's a super great challenge. I love challenges, but it's yeah, it's like I get in the sandbox and it's like, oh my God,
Yeah.
is this gonna work out?
Yeah. Yeah, it's different, right? I mean, I also sometimes look at scores, I don't know, string quartets by Bartok or whatever, and I'm like, damn, man, this is, I could take like 3 bars and make a jazz tune out of that. And, those guys
Yeah,
do like 1 hour of music or whatever, like constantly developing, which, I mean, that's why jazz is jazz, that we improvise then on the basis of something. But yeah, writing this classical, more oriented, it's quite heavy. I mean, it's time consuming and uh,
it's super time consuming. Like
yeah,
there's no way around that. It's
yeah.
very labor intensive. Yeah. There's this great quote by Bach that I like. He wrote, I think he was quoted by one of his students actually. So one of his students was saying that they had difficulty finding good themes for their composition. And Bach said that, on the contrary, when he woke up in the morning, he could hardly set foot on the ground because the ground was just littered with
Mm,
with good themes. And I think what that means is essentially everything, almost everything, can be a good theme. It doesn't really matter. It's like those are the bricks that you use to build the house
yeah,
that the composition is.
yeah,
And the real art is in the building of the house, not in the finding of the brick.
yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. Where does this love for Bach come for you? I mean,
Oh man. Well, I think it started really really early because my mom was an opera singer. She sang in the Paris Opera
okay.
Chorus, and my granddad was a jazz pianist in Oregon. And we had a piano at home, and I was like, as a toddler, I was noodling around on the piano. And so my mom started me on piano lessons when I was 6,
Mm,
and I was in France, and so they started me on Bach almost immediately. And I played the Inventions as a kid, which have been really wonderful to return to recently
hmm
in this album, Inventions, Reinventions. And then as a teenager, I remember being at a friend's house playing chess, and he put on the Goldberg Variations, which I'd never heard before.
mm,
Put on the Glenn Gould recording from
right.
1981. And I remember just being totally shocked by it. Like, oh my God, I remember that moment very well. And so that all stuck with me. And then in my 20s, I got a score of the Goldberg Variations, started practicing them just for fun. And they just remained an object of fascination and obsession. And so that's kind of how my two relationships with the biggest pieces of Bach I've worked on have developed,
Interesting.
the Goldbergs and the Inventions. I've done a lot of other Bach too. I mean, I've performed well-tempered clavier stuff and
Yeah,
the concerti for 2, 3, and 4 keyboards. But I think, I mean, why do people love Bach? Like,
yeah, yeah,
it's just, it feels so primordial, right? It feels like the kind of basis for all the music we make.
mm,
Especially, I mean, in jazz, I would say like that feels like one basis, and then you also have the whole Afro-Cuban basis, which I've been lucky enough to study in Cuba, which
mm,
is also incredibly primordial and incredibly beautiful. Like you take bata rhythms, for
yeah, yeah,
example,
yeah, yeah.
and then you combine the kind of depth of rhythmic thinking there with what Bach was doing, and you have a lot of the ingredients of jazz.
Yeah, definitely. When did I've read you studied astrophysics. So when did the jazz bug happen for you then? I mean, since you had the Bach moment, did you have like also a jazz moment that you said like, shit, I want to
Yeah,
explore this or?
yeah. So my granddad was a jazz pianist on the West Coast, and I was bathed in jazz
Mm,
from a very young age. So I remember basically when I was 6 years old, I started these classical piano lessons and started learning classical pieces, playing things like, like pieces that little kids play. And I would always make my own version of them.
okay.
And it would be like, make a boogie woogie version or make a strange chord version or whatever. Like the idea of playing around with music and making it my own was super natural to me from the get-go. And I remember as a kid going to my classical piano lesson and showing my teacher my improvising, because I was playing a lot of boogie woogie. That was like my big thing. I got into James P. Johnson.
Wow, interesting.
And, I remember showing that to my classical teacher, and he was like, "No, man, absolutely not. You should never do that. You know, just play the classical music that's on the page. Definitely should not improvise." And I think in some alternate reality, I might have taken that advice and been like, "Okay, no, that's bad. I shouldn't do that." But because my granddad was a jazz pianist on the West Coast, I knew that it couldn't possibly be wrong to improvise. I knew that had to be okay, and so I just didn't show it to my classical teacher, but I kept spending like the vast majority of my time at home improvising and listening to records. And I grew up without a TV as an only child, with parents who are an American family in France, and before the internet mostly. I mean, the email, the rudiments of email were just coming in when I was becoming a teenager, basically. Yeah. I was born in 1982. And so there are like no distractions. Like the things I did for fun were read books and play the piano. And so I'd spend just hours improvising. And I was always a little bit rebellious about the classical music. Like that was the thing that my teachers forced me to do. And so I would kind of do it at the last minute. Although I always did love playing Bach, especially. But the improvising, that was my thing. And so, yeah, I mean, that starts when I'm like 6 years old. And I just kept being self-taught. Essentially, I mean, I took a few lessons here and there, but essentially I was self-taught until I did my master's in jazz when I was 21 in Boston. Yeah. Okay.
Interesting. Wow. Okay. Yeah, that all makes then sense.
Yeah.
What you're doing with Bach nowadays. I mean, since the Goldberg and how was your move to New York? I mean, when did you move to New York exactly? And coming to New York, I think I always love this question to everyone, because it's such a mind-blowing experience for everyone to enter this mecca of jazz, and the sheer number of musicians and players. Like, when you moved to New York, who were your first connections that you made? And becoming a band leader, we talked about those early albums, like quite immediately you made Before the Storm, like you were 23, I guess, then, or 22 even.
Yeah, 23, I guess. Yeah, 2005, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Or maybe it's 2004. Actually, you might be right. Maybe I was 22. Yeah.
Oh, that's really early, man. I mean, yeah.
Well,
nowadays not anymore, but yeah.
It felt very natural at the time. I think being a composer, a band leader, being up there playing my own music is always by far the thing that felt the most natural to me. Excuse me. And because so many of my heroes had been great sidemen, I felt like that was a really important thing to do as well, to try to be a sideman as well as I could. But I think at the end of the day, that's not nearly as natural for me than as it is to be a band leader. I've really enjoyed, quote unquote sideman experiences where I'm not really a sideman. So for example, with Lee Konitz, I played and toured with him for 12 years, but I was really encouraged to be highly creative with him. There was never a sense that, he had this exact artistic agenda and that I was kind of a wheel in the cog. Like there is never that. It was, we're up on stage together playing these very open-ended improvisations on jazz standards, or even playing free, and we're here to have a conversation between two human. That's
how did it happen? Great. I mean, I wanted to ask you about Lee later also, but
Lee,
how did this story with Lee begin for you? Because I think you had like probably one of the most long-standing musical relationships that he had, until he died. Basically, he passed away. And how
definitely
did
one of them
begin for you?
Yeah, so actually it connects a bit with your earlier question about what it was like to move to New York.
Oh yeah, okay.
I did this undergraduate bachelor's in astrophysics in the UK, and then I basically a year into that, I felt really strongly that I wanted to make being a professional musician. I wanted to give that a try, and I love the science, and I still love it. Actually, I still find it fascinating, but just the idea of being an artist really attracted me. And so I went to the New England Conservatory for my master's. And, the thing about the NEC, the New England Conservatory, is a really good school. And so everyone who's in the jazz program there is super highly motivated. And so essentially it was the normal thing to do, to move to New York after that. And there was already a community of people from NEC who were mainly living in Brooklyn. And so after I graduated, it was just kind of normal to move to Brooklyn, which is what I did. And so my earliest connections here were people from NEC and their friends. And there were a whole bunch of people like that, really brilliant musicians. And it was a really nice scene. Some of them are still here, some of them not. And of course, I've also met many other people in that respect. But as soon as I arrived in New York, first of all, it was way cheaper at the time. I got a studio in Lefferts Gardens, where actually I still live in Brooklyn, for $700 a month at the time.
Come on.
Yeah, nice studio too. I mean, it was right on Prospect Park. It was a cool place to live, and it was $700. I mean, the neighborhood was still considered to be dangerous, which it totally wasn't. So it was a really different time. I don't know how people do it nowadays who are just moving here. But it was a lot cheaper, but it was still expensive, and so I needed to make money. And so when I first moved here, I started I taught French lessons to people, because I grew up in France. I designed websites for people. That's something I've been doing for a long time, because I've been a computer nerd since I was a kid, programming, since I was like 9 or 10 years old. I accompanied dance classes at the Martha Graham School. And so I was doing all kinds of different things just to make a living and trying to get into the scene and playing as many gigs as I could. And one day I was at home and I put on this duo record by Martial Solal, who's this really great French jazz pianist that I'm sure you're familiar with, and Lee Konitz, called Star Eyes. And I just love this record. It's from the 90s. And I put it on, I was listening to it, and I remember being struck with this really strong conviction that this is something that I could do. That if I got to play with Lee, I would know what to do. Kind of a strange feeling, but I just really had that. I had that as a conviction. And so I emailed Martial, who had acted a little bit as a mentor to me growing up. Excuse me. Who had acted a little bit as a mentor to me growing up in France. And I just said, would you consider introducing me to Lee? And he immediately wrote back saying, of course, here's his number. Just say, excuse me, I think I might need a little water.
Yeah.
Oh,
No worries. Yep.
Hold on just a sec. Yeah, so I emailed Lee, asked him if he would consider introducing me to, I emailed Martial and asked him if he would consider introducing me to Lee. He immediately wrote back saying, of course, here's Lee's number, and just tell him you're calling on my behalf. And I called Lee right away. Lee happened to be home. He answered and he was like, hey, why don't you come over and we can play?
Oh.
And I went over there like probably the next day. And we played, and immediately it was like, oh, this is great. This is really fun. And he invited me to sit in on his next gig, which was at the Jazz Gallery. And that felt really great. And then he just kept asking me to play on more things. And not that long after that, he asked me to do a tour with him in Japan. Wow. And then I did a week with him at Jazz at Lincoln Center at Dizzy's there, and that's what kind of gradually made our musical relationship get as deep as it became. In 2009, so I moved to New York in 2006, and we probably played together for the first time, I think, in early 2007.
Oh, already. Okay.
In 2009, we made a duo record on Sunnyside called Duos with Lee, very original title.
Yeah, it's a beautiful one. I love that one.
Thanks, man. I'm proud of that record.
Yeah.
What's really funny about my records with Lee is that when we were playing in public, in concert, we almost entirely played standards. It's like 95% of what we played was standards. Occasionally we play a free tune, you know, as a kind of a transition between things or whatever. But both times when we recorded as a duo, we played standards and we also played free. And listening back, I was just so taken with the free stuff that that's what both records are almost entirely.
He's quite underrated player like that, right? I mean, people
He's
mostly
super
know
underrated
like,
as a free player.
for All the Things You Are, or whatever, like the standards, and like he could do really beautiful lines, you know. It's like playing open and like, I mean, really melodic type of free, obviously, but it's still amazing. Yeah, quite underrated in that segment, I think. People don't
I mean, I think people who've checked him out as a free player know how incredibly heavy he was, but yeah, it's just not how we tend to think of him. Yeah. But you know, yeah, he was one of the best free players in my opinion. As you say, super melodic. It was every statement was melodic, and it could be super outside. You know, I mean, for example, the first track on our second duo record, Decade.
Yeah.
First of all, he's in his late 80s when we record that, and then I'm just playing like this very atonal accompaniment, and he just finds these perfect melodies over it. It's just so gorgeous, really amazing. So yeah, anyway, the records ended up being mostly free stuff. There's a lot of like bootleg stuff of us playing standards though.
Yeah, so on YouTube,
at some point I want to go through that more and maybe put something else out.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. What do you learn? I mean, that's a stupid question in a sense, but also not, I mean, you could probably talk about that for an hour, but like to sum it up, like what have you learned from Lee, and you know, how has your playing progressed as you kept playing with him through the years?
Okay, so I mean, there's so much to say about that,
yeah,
as you intuited, and I would say that I just feel super lucky to have had that direct experience because, you know, as the saying goes, talking about music is like dancing about architecture. There are things, obviously there's many things that you can talk about regarding music as there are regarding architecture. But there are things about music that really, especially about performing music, that just can't be conveyed. And so just being up on the bandstand with Lee night after night, I think I actually counted the number of concerts we gave because a journalist asked me once after his death, and I think it's 150.
Ooh, man, that's amazing.
Yeah,
that's like 150 universities or something.
Yeah, no, really. I mean, being up with him on the bandstand every time was just, first of all, it was fresh every time. He never phoned it in, not once. Truly incredible. Super present every time. And so yeah, being up there night after night, it was there are things that I think seeped into my being that I wouldn't be able to really explain. But there's one thing that I can explain, or at least talk about. The biggest thing for Lee was meaning. Okay, so just as an example, if you said something meaningful in a conversation, he might say, you ain't just beating your gums up and down. Okay, which is just like one of his cute expressions. Just to point out that what you said was full of meaning, as opposed to many of the empty words that get spoken all the time and that are not full of meaning, that are maybe just there to fill space, right? And so that same desire for meaning was incredibly present in his music, to the extent that Lee essentially evacuated everything that did not have meaning.
Yeah.
So this was really the sieve, the selector for what he played was, thou shalt never play anything that doesn't have meaning. And the notion of meaning itself is incredibly mysterious.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so how do you tell if something has meaning? How do you tell ahead of time if what you are going to play has meaning? Well, I think for me, it really comes down to, do you mean it from your heart? Do you have true heartfelt intention for what you're about to say or play? It doesn't make any difference. So one story I have with Lee is, again, I played with him for a long time, for like 12 years, and I aged a lot during that time. I matured a lot. And he also changed quite a bit during that time. He went from, being full of energy and actually pretty youthful when he was 79, 80, when I first started playing with him, to having a very serious near-death experience in Australia when we were there on tour, and then coming back kind of miraculously, but with a much more sober approach to the music. So anyway, during that process of playing with him over 12 years, I had to kind of continuously reevaluate what it meant to play with him. And I struggled at times. I struggled really. There were times when I was like, well, I need to do my thing. I'm into these kinds of sounds, and like I shouldn't compromise. I should play this stuff that is like my thing, right? A very kind of ego-based approach, I would say.
Yeah, normal. Yeah.
And I could tell it wasn't working. I could tell that I was playing with him, and it was like, just here's this incredible genius next to me making the most beautiful music, and we're just not connecting. So I had to continuously reevaluate. And one day we were in the middle of nowhere in America, about to do a gig, and we were backstage, and I was warming up on the piano, and Lee said, why don't you try only playing what you can sing? And I've always been very good at singing what I'm playing. It's always come very naturally to me. In fact, I'm often singing along without even meaning to. But so I said, okay, I'll try that. So I started playing whatever, All the Things You Are, whatever tune it was. And I very purposely would wait for an idea to come into my ear and only play that. And so it's greatly simplifying what I'm playing. And so I did that for a while. And Lee was like, Dan, I think that's you. That sounds like you. And you might want to consider doing that. And so for me, in my mind, it's like, no, man, like if I do that, it's such simple music, I have all these like complicated ideas that I want to be doing. But because I trusted Lee and loved him, I decided to try that night, and I recorded it, and I listened back, and I was like, oh my God, this is actually full of meaning. And also the audience, reacted in a very different way. But I listened back, I was like, this is actually full of meaning. And suddenly ideas of whether this is corny or old-fashioned or simple, I think go way out the window, because you realize here's somebody who's just saying something meaningful. And something meaningful, I think, is always new. It always has value in any case. I'm convinced of that. And it's always interesting, Whereas you can have all the most kind of technical ideas and stuff in the world. Yeah. If they're not meaningful, I think they're not interesting, or they just feel kind of like noise. Yeah. So yes, meaning was at the heart of everything he did. Truth, right? So you could substitute the word truth for meaning, because when something is meaningful, it feels truthful. Not necessarily that it's saying an objective truth about the world, but it is saying at least an emotional, subjective truth about the world. And when we're making art, it's all about subjective truth, but it's its own kind of truth, right? So I think that sieve, that selector of singing, was at the core of
Mm.
who Lee was. You know, whenever he's playing, it sounds like he's singing, and he loved to sing. We spent countless hours singing together. Anytime we were traveling in the car, we'd sing together. Even when I visited him at the hospital, when he was a few times when he went to the hospital, we'd get into that hospital room and sing together. And so singing was at the core of it. That's the source of the meaning, because it's very hard to sing something you don't mean. It's easy to
Yeah,
play
yeah.
something on the piano that you don't mean, or you get on the saxophone and you can kind of like wiggle your fingers around, or play stuff that you've memorized or whatever. But when you're singing, you basically have to mean what you're singing. And yeah, that's the biggest
Amazing.
thing I learned from Lee was, and I try to stay true to that to this day. That's the big thing. It's like, let me please only play things that really have meaning to me, not play any bullshit. That's the big thing. And I think I still believe that is incredibly important.
Yeah. Especially, yeah, when you're young, you kind of, it's hard to accept that. But yeah, as you grow older, I think it becomes more and more meaningful. Makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like all these guys, you know, being a guitarist, like for me, Jim Hall is like kind of Lee Konitz, same
Mm.
style, you know, like eliminating anything, everything it's not there, and the use of space and all of that. Like all these guys, that's just like, damn, man, you
Yeah.
know, beautiful. Yeah. Dan, I wanted to ask you also, I read like years ago already, you wrote a blog about Paul Motion when
Mm.
Paul passed away. And you know, I'm such a huge fan of Paul as a drummer and also as a composer, you know, speaking of eliminating stuff, like having a 7-note melody and it works. And what was your story with Paul actually?
Well, I love Paul. You know, I mean, I'm sure that's not an original statement. I loved him ever since I started hearing him. I think the first records of his I heard were with Bill Evans,
Yeah,
when I was, you know, probably, I don't know, 8 or 9 years old. Always loved his playing.
yeah,
Just really stood out in that kind of fierce, very original way. And how did I meet him for the first time? You know, when I moved to New York, one of the really wonderful things was that Paul was playing all the time, because he had decided, I'm not exactly sure what year he decided this, but definitely before 2006, he decided he no longer wanted to travel
to go to
at
Europe.
all.
Yeah, yeah,
Not just Europe. I mean, he
yeah. In
basically
general,
didn't
really,
travel at all.
really.
Leaving Manhattan was a big deal for him. He would
Oh,
sometimes do recording sessions in Brooklyn, but you had to like get him a car, you know, that would take him to Brooklyn. He just was sick and tired of traveling and would not travel anymore. And so suddenly here's this giant of jazz who is just in Manhattan all the time. And as a result, he played all the time in Manhattan because there was a market. I mean, people really loved to hear him. He was at the Vanguard a lot. He was playing in other people's bands. Um, so anyway, I used to go hear him all the time with you know, the Paul Motion Trio with Joe Lovano and Bill Frisell, which is one of my all-time
well,
favorite bands.
yeah.
I heard that dozens of times at the Vanguard. And I think I'm trying to remember how I met him for the first time. You know, Paul was a hard guy to meet. I mean, he was a really tough dude. Like if he
Old school. Yeah,
super old school, but just like really fierce. I mean, if he didn't have a genuine reason to be excited to talk to you, he just really didn't give a shit and would let you know. Uh, he was not a polite person, you know. On the other hand, if to the people he actually cared about, he was really wonderful.
Hmm.
Um, so I think, let's see, I think the first time I played with him, yeah, the first time I played with him was with Lee, actually.
Really. Oh,
Yeah, we did a week at Birdland
oof.
with him. And yeah, it was just incredible to play with him. And then after that, I had a duo series at the Cornelia Street Cafe, which was this great venue in New York that
Yeah, yeah.
has
Cornelia was amazing,
since
man. Yeah.
closed. Yeah. So I did I used to do a duo there every month. I did play with great people there, man. I played with Gary Peacock,
Oof, shit.
played with Paul.
Did you record some of
Uh,
that stuff, or?
yeah, they're bootlegs.
Oh
Yeah, they're
man,
bootlegs of
you
that
should
stuff. Yeah.
somehow get this out, and if that's possible, it's like,
Yeah. Yeah, a friend of mine actually recorded the gig
man.
with Paul. I have that. I played with Becca Stevens,
Beautiful.
Mark Turner, yeah, uh, Julian Lage. Yeah,
Really
really
beautiful.
great people. Um, but so I kind of, after I played with Paul, with Lee, I got my courage up and asked him if he might do this. And I remember really well, he was like, sure, it'll be $1,000. Which I don't know if you remember, Cornelia Street was tiny.
Yeah, I know. I played
And
there once.
so,
Yeah.
yeah. So I was like, man, $1,000. Wow. But then I talked to the guy who was booking the series at Cornelia, and he was like, Paul is probably going to pack this place. We're going to do 2 sets, and we'll do 2 independent sets. We'll charge the audience twice for both of them. And he was totally right. We packed it, and I actually ended up making like $200 for me.
Wow, that's
which
amazing.
At the time was not so bad for me.
Yeah.
And so I was like, holy shit, Paul priced himself exactly correctly. Which is it was such a lesson for me. It was like, wow, it sounds like a lot of money, but it's actually not. It's actually exactly the correct price. And that was just magical playing with him duo. And actually he was really generous. He really liked it. And he asked me after that to do a week with him at the Vanguard trio, which ended up not happening. It was right before he got sick, and that's a longer story why that didn't happen. But yeah, I'm very, very grateful for that time with Paul. I got to have dinner with him a few times, and just hang with him backstage, talking. I was all super intimidated by him. But the thing about him, though, he was super intimidating. But when you were on the bandstand with him, he was. Yeah, I actually have a story about that. I forget who it was, but there was someone who ended up in his band in the Paul Motion group.
Yeah.
And he was touring with him, and he felt like Paul was vibing him all the time, like just giving him a really bad vibe. Like he just felt super insecure about his contribution to the music, just felt like, man, I can't do anything right in this band. And so one day he got his courage up and he said to Paul, man, I don't know if I can keep doing this. Like, I just feel like everything I do is wrong. And I just feel like you're not liking what I'm doing. And Paul said, listen, man, once we're on the bandstand, we're equals. And that gave him the courage to go up there and just really try to be himself. Like it went from, I'm here to please Paul, to I'm here to please myself and be true to myself, which Lee also very much made me understand when I played with him. Anytime he felt like I wasn't bringing what I had to bring, he would say that to me. Like, look, man, I didn't hire you to play like it's 1965. Like, I hired you to be yourself.
Yeah.
So anyway, as intimidating as Paul was, I really felt when we were on the bandstand together that what he wanted to do, the only thing that he cared about was make good music together, make quality music together. And so, I saw him a number of times with bands at the Vanguard where the music was kind of not happening, and he would start doing things like just like banging on the drums really hard, doing things that could strike you as kind of anti-musical. But to me, it seemed very obvious that it was what he was searching for was to wake up the band and to like get it out of complacency. I mean, jazz can get so complacent. It's like, okay, we're playing the right chords and we're playing, the right tunes, and it's just like nothing's happening. And I think Paul was really devoted to there being something happening. And so I really felt that when he was on the bandstand. It wasn't actually an ego thing. It was not going to be about him. It was going to be about the music. And like that time we played duo, man, it was just beautiful. Like his time was so profound. Just felt like this bedrock that was inviting you to make the best music you could.
Did you guys play tunes or free, or both, actually?
On that gig, combination of free and tunes. Yeah.
Amazing, man. And you have that recorded?
I do actually. Yeah. My friend Lena
Okay.
Block. I don't even know. I wouldn't have recorded it. I think I'm pretty sure he told me that it couldn't be recorded.
Sure.
But actually, a couple of years later, my friend Lena Block was in the audience. Said, "Hey, by the way, I brought in a recorder to that gig.
That's fantastic.
So I have it. Yeah.
Fantastic. Then not to take too much of your time, I just wanted to ask you also, you mentioned Billy Hart before, that you played duo with him. And, I listened to the record you guys did, like where you play Sam Rivers and Dolphin
His
or
record.
Ornette. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I love to hear you play that, because, there are not so many chances that you actually play that actually on record. Like, what was your story with Billy? Or is, I mean, still, I guess.
Yeah, I really want to play with him again. I have a date later this year that just came in, and I think I'm going to ask him if he's up for it.
Beautiful.
I love Billy. Oh my God, what a just beautiful musician. Maestro with Billy, I used to go hear him all the time, and he's such a friendly guy. I introduced myself, and he was always just super nice. And I forget I forget how it happened, but he asked me to be on that record of his, and it was just a bunch of young guys that he asked to do this session, and we showed up and made that recording. And then after that, I asked him to play on a couple of these duo series that I did. But actually, also we toured with John Raymond, who's a wonderful trumpeter. So he had a band with Billy and me and Joe Martin. We made a couple records. So I actually got to tour with Billy in that band. But I feel like it's an unfinished story. I would like to play with him more.
Beautiful. Yeah, fantastic.
One of my favorite musicians.
You said you might do a gig with him, but what's still on the schedule for you for this year? I mean, what are your plans touring wise and recording wise? I mean, are you coming to Europe still as a?
Yeah, I have some stuff in Europe. So right now, things, the year was so insane until the end of June, and so now things are a little bit chiller. But basically, I'm playing Inventions Reinventions in upstate New York at the end of the month, and then I have a nice concert of Natural Machines, which is this project where I've written computer algorithms that improvise with me and generate graphics in real time. Doing that at the La Jolla Festival in California in mid-August. And then I have Inventions and Natural Machines in Virginia in early September, Chamber Music Festival there. And then at the end of September, I have stuff in Europe, playing Inventions, Reinventions in France, and also in Lisbon, also in Madrid. October, there's stuff in the US. Like that, mainly at this point, focusing on Inventions, Reinventions, and Natural Machines. Those are the two big projects that I'm touring right now.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, what is today? Monday. I'll leave you a nice Monday afternoon. So, but not to take more of your time. But thanks, man, again for finding the time that we got together and share some of the stories you have.
Samo, it's a total pleasure, man. Thank you so much for checking out the work I've been doing for all these years. I'm really honored.
Yeah. Well, thank you for finding the time and.